Jnana ॐ ह्रीं ह्रीतं त्वमचलो गुणजीवगुणेढ्या नक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कलशं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्त्यलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्रोद्धृतोऽपि न च भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव बन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृप्ततृष्णा रागे कृते हृतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणं नाशम् कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारी स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेक गम्य तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीन बन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्म स्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। मांगल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातनी गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनाथ परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्याते हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय। चरणाश्रयदानेन कृपामयि नमोऽस्तु ते लज्जापटावृते नित्यं शारदे ज्ञानदायिके पापेभ्यो न सदा कृपामयि नमोऽस्तु ते रामकृष्णगतप्राण तन्नाम श्रवणप्रिया तद्भावरञ्जिताकारा प्रणमामि मुहुर्मुहुः पवित्रं चरितं यस्या पवित्रं जीवनं तथा पवित्रता स्वरूपिणे तस्यै कुर्मो नमो नमः देवीं प्रसन्नां प्रणतातिहन्त्री योगेन्द्रपूजा युगधर्मपात्रे तां शरणं भक्तिविज्ञानदात्री दया स्नेहेन वन्दासि मनोस्मदीय दोषानुशेषा सगुणीकरोषि अहेतुनानोदय स्वाङ्गे गृहीत्वा यदिदं विचित्रं प्रसीद मातः विनयेन या प्रेमैकबिन्दु विषिञ्च चेतं कुरु न सुशान्तं जननीं शारदां देवी रामकृष्णं जगद्गुरु पादपद्मे तयो श्रीत्वा प्रणमामि मुहुर्मुहुः प्रणमामि मुहुर्मुहुः
Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swami Tapaharine. So we are resuming this lecture of Swami Vivekananda on realization after a gap of about 3 weeks. And towards the end of the last discussion, we had concluded with this paragraph which said that the watchword of Vedanta is to realize, meaning to make real. Make real in the same way that in our normal day-to-day existence we regard the world as real. And he concluded that paragraph with these few words where he basically starts off on a diatribe about these more naive notions of heaven and hell and so on. But what then about heaven? And he basically traces the idea in human minds, the idea of heaven, and where does it come from? And he says this, what then about heaven? It was the idea of happiness minus unhappiness. That is to say, that what we want is the joys of this life minus its sorrows. That is a very good idea, no doubt. It comes naturally, but it is a mistake throughout, because there is no such thing as absolute good, nor any such thing as absolute evil. So herein, essentially, first I think he starts dismissing the idea of a heaven and traces it to this desire in human hearts. See, finally, the study of any of this Vedanta or Jnana Yoga, it rests on a certain sharp analysis, and that analysis is not something outside, but something that is intrinsic to our temperament, to our psyche. Not something mystical, not something imaginary, but something that can be empirically observed in ourselves, and must be universal in the sense that more or less any human being who has been through some part of life will be able to identify with these basic tenets. And so that's why you have a bunch of people living today who have found this idea of heaven or this idea of hell where you're roasted or fried in oil, etc., etc. These are kind of naive things meant to scare people. Or essentially because if we do something good, we expect a reward in this world. The idea of a heaven is a kind of a reward, for having lived so-called good life. And these few sentences here strikes at the root of this idea, and not only does it strike at the root of this idea of pleasure or pain hereafter, it also strikes at the root of the idea which gives rise to these ideas of heaven and hell. What is it? And this is what he says basically, that this idea of heaven or hell is really a mistake. Why? Because it assumes that this idea of good or evil that we have, the good life leads to heaven, the bad life leads to hell. These ideas of good and evil are essentially social constructs, or to a great extent social constructs based on some more universal, more fundamental principle. So for example, this golden rule which the Christians talk about, for instance, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What is that assuming? It is assuming that, and that's really the basis of the system of democracy that we have across the world today, as not as something infallible, but as an attempt towards realizing some ideal in society. What is that? It basically says that any other person, any person who we regard as an other, is entitled to the same benefits that I am, and is capable of suffering the same pain as I am. Other words, it is finding this locus of human joy or pain as something that is not special to one human being, but something that is common to all. Once that is accepted as a fact, once it is accepted that yes, anybody, any living creature suffers pain and experiences joy, what follows is that just as I would like to move myself away from pain and towards joy, the other person has an equal right to do so, and therefore my behavior or actions should ensure that not only me but others are in a position to experience the same joys that I would, and something that causes me pain is not something I would like to inflict on another. So this is the basis of the ethics that we practice in society, and it is not something absolute, because something that causes me pain might or might not necessarily. So once one gets into the subtler, grayer domains, yes, the experience of pain and pleasure or pain and joy is something that is universal, accepted. But what would give one individual joy is not something universal. Ethics is not something universal, it is conditioned by society. This is the foundation of this statement: there is no such thing as absolute good, nor any such thing as absolute evil. And he expands on that. You have all heard of that rich man in Rome who learnt one day that he had only about £1 million of his property left. He said, "What shall I do tomorrow?" and forthwith committed suicide. £1 million was poverty to him. What is joy and what is sorrow? It is a vanishing quantity, continually vanishing. When I was a child, I thought if I could be a cabman, it would be the very acme of happiness for me to drive about. I do not think so now. To what joy will you cling? This is the one point we must all try to understand, and it is one of the last superstitions to leave us. Everyone's idea of pleasure is different. I have seen a man who is not happy unless he swallows a lump of opium every day. So for instance, take somebody who is a drug addict somewhere, and without a source, a plentiful supply of that drug, that person is going to be physically unwell. Though at some level that person knows that it is poison, it is killing. Nevertheless, the system has been trained in such a way that without that drug a person cannot live. Everyone's idea of pleasure is different. I have seen a man who is not happy unless he swallows a lump of opium every day. He may dream of a heaven where the land is made of opium. That would be a very bad heaven for me. Again and again in Arabian poetry, we read of heaven with beautiful gardens through which rivers run. I lived much of my life in a country, India, where there is too much water. Many villages are flooded and thousands of lives are sacrificed every year. So my heaven would not have gardens through which rivers flow. I would have a land where very little rain falls. Our pleasures are always changing. If a young man dreams of heaven, he dreams of a heaven where he will have a beautiful wife. When that same man becomes old, he does not want a wife. It is our necessities which make our heaven, and the heaven changes with the change of our necessities. If we had a heaven like that desired by those to whom sense enjoyment is the very end of existence, then we would not progress. That would be the most terrible curse we could pronounce on the soul. Is this all we can come to? A little weeping and dancing, and then to die like a dog? What a curse you pronounce on the head of humanity when you long for these things. That is what you do when you cry after the joys of this world, for you do not know what true joy is. What philosophy insists on is not to give up joys, but to know what joy really is. The Norwegian heaven is a tremendous fighting place where they all sit before Odin. They have a wild boar hunt, and then they go to war and slash each other to pieces. But in some way or another, after a few hours of such fighting, the wounds are all healed up, and they go into a hall where the boar has been roasted and have a carousel. And then the wild boar takes form again, ready to be hunted for the next day. That is much the same thing as our heaven, not a whit worse, only our ideas may be a little more refined. We want to hunt wild boars and get to a place where all enjoyments will continue, just as the Norwegian imagines that the wild boar is hunted and eaten every day and recovers the next day. What is the point of this paragraph? First, it exposes the shallowness or superficiality of the idea of heaven. And essentially says that, look, so if we think that these Vikings or people who lived in many hundred years back, they had a rather primitive idea. I mean, we would probably laugh at such ideas. And it's the curious thing is that if one grows up in a particular culture where one has heard of a certain idea of heaven, it does not look ludicrous to us. The idea of heaven of another person coming from a different society, a different culture, seems ridiculous. How can people be so silly and childish? These are questions we ask ourselves. Little do we recognize that our own ideas of heaven and hell are just about as silly and as superficial as the other people's. And so one goes to the cause of these ideas and identifies that, look, it is not something outside that one is dreaming of, not something outside that one is imagining, but it is in our own psyche. We want pleasures, we want to avoid pains. So if there is a common shared source of joy, so for instance, in the Arabian sands, rain is something that everybody desires. Why? Because it's a dry climate. Water is a scarcity. Therefore, people covet water. It's as simple as that. Nothing else. Nothing mystical. Nothing to spin theories about. So what would because such people would covet water, they would dream of a heaven where there is plenty of water. And Vivekananda says, grew up in Bengal, where there are floods and people die of excess water. So, excess water or water in this plentiful quantity is not something that would be coveted, And they would probably, and people growing up in such a place would probably covet a more milder climate with less of this pouring rain. So on in various other places. And it is the society dependent on various natural conditions which decides what the community at large desires, covets, and what it would like to avoid. And it is these shared ideas, nothing more, nothing less, that give rise to these stories about heavens and hells. So it's essentially the locus of these ideas is not to be hunted for in some mystical twilight, in some heaven which is not something that we can see, but rather to be understood in terms of introspecting in our own minds, in our own hearts, to understand what are shared pleasures, what are shared pains, and what is it in those things that is common that has given rise to these ideas of heaven, these ideas of hell, etc. And it's essentially this idea, and this is exactly what it is, this idea that we desire for ourselves joys and want to avoid pain. That's all there is. And because we desire certain pleasures and want to avoid pain, our ideas of a heaven are something where there is this pleasure or joy minus the pain. And what is it that is being said here? Saying that essentially such dreams are pointless, meaningless. Why? Because the idea or concept of pleasure would not exist without the corresponding concept of pain. The concept of pain would not exist without the corresponding concept of pleasure. And therefore, if one is interested in the truth there, then one must come to something which is a witness, which is something that understands what pleasure is and what pain is. And this is why he says, this is this marvelous little one sentence that is hidden in this whole paragraph. What philosophy insists on, philosophy means not just something that is an intellectual throwing around game, but analytical philosophy where the will of the individual is guided by this kind of thinking. What philosophy insists on is not to give up joys. In another place he says, it does not mean that you make your heart a barren waste saying that, oh, I don't want this joy, I don't want this joy. That's the surest way to depression. Not to give up joy, but to know what joy really is. So what is it that is being said here? It's the mindless joys that are being talked about, where one is a product of one's surroundings. Surroundings dictate for us, tell narratives to us about, oh, you should experience joy while eating sweets. That's something. There are some societies. And then somebody does not like them. They say, oh, that's a very unusual thing to do. And then the person trains himself or herself to start liking these objects. It's essentially being able to step back from that experience and see it for what it is. A little titillation of the mind, a little titillation of the senses, and then it's gone. Is that really what joy is? And this is exactly the point where this analysis needs to be done. That is why when Yama offered Nachiketa pleasures, what we think of normally as joys, His response was exactly this: Shobhava martyasya yadanta kaitat sarvendriyanam jarayanti teja api sarvam jivitam alpameva tavaiva baha tava nritya gite. So all these little sources of pleasure that you are trying to entice me with, which titillate the senses, only end up exhausting a person. There is nothing lasting in these. And it is, joy then is something that is accompanied by this knowledge, by this confidence that this does not pass. This is something that is independent of conditions, which means that yes, for the time being, my mind might be miserable. I might have pain in the foot. I might have gotten bitten by a bunch of mosquitoes. Yes, it's causing some irritation. But at the same time, there is nothing permanent in this irritation, in this pain. It will pass. This understanding, which allows us to grasp that what we call pain is not something permanent, it will pass, is a knowledge of the experience of pain. So also with the experience of pleasure. Taste an ice cream, it tastes good, but it is gone the next moment. Once it passes the tongue and gets into the stomach, it's gone. As an aside, I would like to say, why do most human beings have, at least in childhood, this fascination for sweets? And the basic reason is biological. It's essentially the fact that we as human beings grew up from or evolved from other animal species which would like to store glucose, which is a source of energy. Therefore, sweets, it's something that is dictated to us by our biology, nothing more, nothing less. And even today, when most of us lead sedentary lives, we have this, our biological evolution has been outstripped by this social evolution. And therefore, we lead sedentary lives by this division of labor in society, which means each of us has some specialized work, and many of us go to offices, lead sedentary lives. And we don't need that amount of sugar. However, our biology is still stuck at least a million years back, where people would grab any source of sugar because they would not know when it would come next, and then insert that into their body to make sure that they would have energy to hunt around for more food and hunt boars, etc., subsequently. And it is this more primitive form of life where essentially the species, human beings, are essentially hunters and gatherers, and therefore their source of nourishment comes from animals, wild animals that they hunt, could be wild boars, and that has, this primeval thing has given rise to this idea of a heaven. And though we have evolved beyond that level to a society where we basically work on the basis of a division of labor, those ideas have not let go our minds. They have become defunct for the thinking individual, but for those who are not accustomed to thinking about these things, they still continue to influence them. Perhaps, and this is some story that was spun for maybe 1,000 years, essentially, oh, that is there in this ancient book, and therefore it is something to be respected and accepted. And no questions are supposed to be asked. Why? Because if you ask questions of these things, then the foundation through which certain people ruled over society, that foundation is going to be overthrown. So really, it's a kind of a power struggle that leads to this kind of a belief system. Not very much more than that. Okay, so at the end of all this, what are we trying to say? It is that this notion of a heaven or a notion of a place where there is joy and pleasure without pain is something that is mistaken, it's mistaken basically because it is not conceivable once you start thinking about it. This belief without questioning is really questioning the foundations of these things. What is it really? It is essentially a prescription for mindlessness, a prescription to dull the intellect. That cannot be a path that anybody who takes pleasure in finding truth, something that lasts, whose interest is in foundational questions, that person whose interest is in such would not be led away from his query by such injunctions. These injunctions are an injunction for mindlessness. And so, once one throws away this prejudice, it is not by saying that, oh, this is old, therefore I discard it, by a cultivated irreverence. No. It is essentially that my quest is for something more fundamental, namely truth. Something that really lasts. And so, these stories about heavens, these stories about hells, etc., are found to be unsatisfactory. They are found to be wanting. Good. Let us recognize, and this is really one of the reasons that this hereafter in this mystical sense has to a great extent lost its hold on the minds and hearts of people who like to think through things. All right, so what about people who have started to think through things? And here, after having dismissed this more superficial idea of a heaven, he starts with the answer to the more fundamental question. After all, some practice has to be given. Some symbol, because we as human beings are accustomed towards thinking in terms of symbols. So what is the symbol and what does it really denote? Is to be given as a replacement for this idea of heaven and hell. Yes, we've discarded this. But what takes its place? Something more fundamental. What is more fundamental? And here is the answer, starts here. That which all the Vedas declare, which is proclaimed by all penances, seeking which men lead lives of continence, I will tell you in one word, it is Om. You will find this word Om praised very much in the Vedas, and it is held to be very sacred. Question is why? Is it just replacing an idea of heaven by some equally superficial idea? And this is to be inquired into. See, after all, this is addressing the inquiring mind, not somebody who is apt to be mindless. So this is not to be accepted just because it is said here, but it is to be inquired into. Let me read the original verse from the Kathopanishad. Sarve Veda Yat Padam Amananti Tapangsi Sarvani Chayat Vadanti Yadichanto Brahmacharyam Charanti Tatte Padam Sangrahena Bravimi Om Iti Etat. This is the original verse from the Kathopanishad, and then there is praise for this. Etad hi eva aksharam brahma, etad hi eva aksharam param, etad hi eva aksharam gnatva, yo yat ichhati tasya tat. Etat alambanam shreshtham, etat alambanam param, etat alambanam gnatva, Brahmaloke mahiyate. This is the place, these 3 verses, it's the place where Yama switches gears. And after dismissing the more superficial things, he starts zooming in towards an answer to Nachiketa's questions. The previous verses were essentially training or making the mind receptive to what he was about to say. Here also, it is just preliminary to the correct answer. And so what does he say? See, finally at the end of it, these Upanishads are supposed to be addressed to sadhakas. Who are sadhakas? You and me. What are sadhakas? People to whom this question of whether there is some statement that something exists after death makes sense, or is one gone after, does it make sense to ask if a person continues to be after death? Or does that person cease to be after death? This was the question that Nachiketa asked. And if that question is there in our minds and hearts, then and then only will there be any interest in reading this or in trying to grasp the answer that Yama, through this story, is offering to us. And so, suppose there is some preliminary mental framework which says that there is some interest in the answer to this question. Once that preliminary qualification is there, then the real answer will make an impact, provided the rest of the mind, which keeps throwing up its garbage and covering up, that faculty of the mind has been a little removed, or has been a little quietened. Yeah. So after having built up through this kind of ethics, etc., oriented towards making the mind receptive, he tells you the symbol. He tells us as sadhakas, inquirers, the symbol which would be a way, or finally, after all, one has to talk in words, and therefore a suitable symbol is necessary, and that symbol is Om. But what that symbol connotes is being explained here. See, after all, if the symbol did not have real subjective content, if it was not meaningful, then it would just be a symbol, just like one of these stories of heavens and hells. And therefore, it is to be inseparably intertwined with its content. That is what is being done here. And that's why he's saying, see, Sarve Veda, all the Vedas, all the sacred scriptures, Yat Padam Amananti. Padam means 2 things. In subsequent more bhakti literature, it talks about feet. But Padam really means a station or a position or a post. See, he had asked for, is a person mortal? That means after he is dead, he's gone forever. Or does that person continue to be after body goes? And here is what is being said as an answer. That which is being talked about by all the Vedas, attainment to which is the goal of all tapas, all penance, desiring which people live a life of sense control, that position, that station, that post, I am going to talk about it in one word, it is Om. Which means that which you are really coveting, really desiring, based on which desire you are asking this question. It's a genuine question from Nachiketa, and Yama treats it as a genuine question. Not some not something that is thrown up by intellectual cogitation. And he gives the name to it. Name is just Om because it's a symbol. But he says, look, this is the symbol of that which is at the foundation of the question you are asking, and that name is Om. And then, to make again Nachiketa's mind more receptive to this answer that he is going to expand on, he goes on to say, Etat hi eva aksharam brahma. Akshara. See, this idea of Brahman, etc., Atman, etc., these might sound like mystical things which come and go. But he says, look, this Om is really a symbol of that which you are really inquiring into, and the sages call this Brahma Jigyasa. This is the Param, that of which there is nothing further, nothing second. And once one knows this not in the sense of something that is a bunch of words, but knows it with one's full being, yo yat ichhati tasya tat. Whatever was desired is fulfilled. Not in terms of something external, but having gone to the root of where all these wants spring from, where all our wants are unified, generalized, universalized. Etat alambanam shreshtam. This is the greatest alambana. Alambana means support. It's our greatest support. Etat alambanam param. It's the supreme support. Etat alambanam gnatva. Having known this. Brahmaloke mahiyate. See, after all, finally you are accustomed to thinking in terms of heavens. Well, this place, this station, this position, where all these lesser ideas get absorbed, if you have to call it a loka, call it Brahmaloka, which means the supreme, Bringhanat Brahman, not in the sense of again in some mystical heaven on earth. It is when you are identified with that station which is called everything or all. If one has become identified with the essence of all existence, there is no second. This word loka literally means, again this is a Sanskrit word, it has a precise meaning, lukyate bhujyate iti loka. Yeah? Where something or the other is enjoyed. What is enjoyed here? This identity of one with all, where there is no second thing left to enjoy. So it's essentially a finger pointing towards that conclusion. Etadalambanam gnatva brahmaloke mahiyate. So we'll return to this, and essentially from the next paragraph, after having given the symbol. So the first, all the superficial ideas of heaven dismissed. Next, a symbol given, and essentially its superiority to these ideas, to the more superficial ideas indicated. And finally, once the mind is concentrated, focused through the practice of understanding what this Om really means, the mind has been now focused, then Yama is going to give the precise answer to Nachiketa's original question. We'll return to this next week. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.